I am very happy to be here. What I didn't actually put into my deck at all is any kind of bio about where I come from or what I've been doing. So the very, very short of it is, for starters, I'm a black woman with a degree in computer science, which sadly makes me a little bit of a unicorn, makes me cry just about every day. But I've been in tech about 30 years and have the good fortune to have worked on some pretty transformative technologies over the course of my career. So I worked on something called Shockwave, which I think maybe all the people over 50 left, but thank you. Which basically transformed the web. Before Shockwave, the web did not move. It was static text and graphics. And so we introduced animation literally the first time the web moved. Several of us who are attending this conference worked on these kinds of technologies. For the younger crowd among you, I also helped launch Hulu. And I ran digital at BET, the television network, and then I worked at the White House under President Obama, where I served as the Chief Digital Service Officer for the US Department of Education. Yeah, it was pretty awesome. So I also co-founded a company called TEQuitable, because we are using technology to make workplaces more equitable. And so kind of my experience, having worked in tech, in media and entertainment, in the federal government, I also have a random connection to USA Gymnastics, because I'm a professional gymnastics photographer, because isn't everybody? And so, you know, my experience and then what I'm doing now kind of led me to this place of trying to figure out, look, if we can send a Tesla Roadster into outer space, maybe we can use some of these same best practices right here on our home planet to solve some of the issues of the underserved, the underrepresented, and the underestimated. And that's how TEQuitable came to be. And really understanding that we really could use technology to solve what had been previously thought of as intractable problems. In particular, one of the things, and I'll get into a little bit about what TEQuitable does, but one of the things that's really important is understanding that it's not just the extreme cases, right? It's not just, you know, my boss groped me in the bathroom, or things that are kind of overt discrimination, sexual assault, that it's the death by 1,000 paper cuts that really affect your day-to-day work lives. And that's part of what we built TEQuitable around. If you twist your ankle, there's got to be something before you call 911, right? We're the triage. We talk to you about rest and elevation, right? Rest, compression, elevation, and I, whatever I is. And so, ice. It is ice. There we go. And so that's the idea, right? It's how do we help companies get in front of some of these issues? How do we help employees figure out how to handle them in whatever is going to work best for them? And so that's what we do as a whole at TEQuitable. In particular, I wanted to make sure we don't tend to talk about the microaggressions. People are like, yeah, they happen, but what do we do about them? There are solutions. There are super active, concrete things that we can do. And so I've kind of decided to start talking about them out loud. And here I am. So let's just go. So this is a workshop, which means it's going to be super interactive. I have a deck. You should not have high expectations. We're going to work it through. So one of the things that I wanted to do is go through things that people hear pretty frequently. So who's ever gotten this before? You're so articulate. What they mean is you're black, but you're so articulate. You speak such good English. like my great-great-great-parents were born here. What are we talking about? If there's somebody who's blind, and you'd be surprised at how people will actually talk louder. Turns out that's not the disability. You're too pretty to be an engineer, or too social, or whatever you want. So we'll break some of these down, and then I'm going to actually ask for other examples from the audience. Oh, I'm also going to try to end at 11:50. Okay, because the schedule said 12. Okay, perfect. And then, of course, you get these things, and then the flip side of it, right, if you are on the receiving end of it, you'll get people saying to you these kinds of things, right? You're being too sensitive. You're overreacting. That's not what they meant, right? Those kinds of things. And so that's the shape and form that microaggressions take. So just to define microaggressions real specifically, so everybody we're all talking about the same language, same page. Oh, hey, look, there's a screen. So microaggressions are the everyday slights, indignities, put-downs, and insults of those who are marginalized that they experience in the day-to-day interactions with people. The thing about microaggressions is that they often appear in the form of a compliment. In fact, we have a learning module within TEQuitable, and we call it how to respond to backhanded compliments, right? And that's that's the subtlety of it. It's like there's a hidden insult in there. It's not really a compliment, no matter kind of what the person intended. And the other thing about it is typically, right, there are people who are jerks and who are racist or homophobic or transphobic or kind of any of the isms. But a lot of the microaggressions are from people who consider themselves good people, who really don't think of themselves as racist or sexist or whatever it might be. And even a lot of people who consider themselves allies, not for nothing, that's real. And I'll kind of get into how I talked about this. Oh, they're back. So this term was actually coined in 1970 by an African-American psychiatrist and Harvard University professor. His name is Chester Pierce. And originally, he used it to describe insults that were ascribed to African-Americans specifically. And then over the course of time, specifically in this century, the term has kind of been, it's now in regular parlance for other types of marginalized folks or other insults for people. So part of the reason I'm doing this workshop is I had coffee with somebody who is not in the room, so I'll talk about her. I'm not going to tell you her name. Asian woman who is prominent in tech, in VC, in entrepreneurship, and who vocally considers herself an ally. Is out there publicly, talks about allyship, talks about how she wants to actually change the world of entrepreneurship and fundraising. And again, specifically, she's focused on gender more than other things. But so I think I gave her the example of, oh, you're black, but you're so articulate. She was like, no, that doesn't happen. And I was like, I don't. But where have you been? Who are your friends? Who do you, what do you mean? Have you never heard this? I'm so confused right now. Because again, she's out there publicly as an ally. And it was so jarring to me. And it finally got to a place where she's like, oh, I guess I could see that because some man had said to her, the day before, something about her being, too pretty to be a VC or whatever it was, right? And she was like, oh, so I kind of see, I can relate that to something that just happened to me, and I can see where that still is happening. But the fact that she was oblivious to what every black person in the room knows happens, right? It was so, I was like, clearly we need to tell this story. And part of it is, I know that I only tend to talk about this stuff with my people in my community, right? So I'll talk about black issues, I'll talk about women's issues, I'll talk about whatever they might be. But I only talk to people who are like me about those things. So one of the things I want to make sure we do is we talk about other things that have happened to other people in the room to create a sense of awareness, because you don't necessarily know. I will say, I am not the end-all and be-all. I'm not the expert. I do not guarantee that I am not going to mistakenly perform an act of microaggression, right? That's not, none of us are perfect, and none of us have lived every single experience under the sun. And so I think we all have a lot to learn. But I just thought it was really important. I was just so shocked that I was like, we should talk about this out loud. Okay, so the other thing is we talked about this whole really, how badly did that hurt your feelings? You should get over it. And while they do seem, right, they're backhanded compliments, they're kind of slights, they are, but they have a huge impact. They are, right, they can affect mental health, they can affect your work environment, they certainly perpetuate stereotype threat, they can create physical problems, right, the anxiety that people feel around the toxic work environments. It certainly is an indicator of kind of what the broader society feels about you, and increases your work productivity. and can actually contribute to kind of societal issues as well in terms of inequities in education, employment, and healthcare, right? So it's not like we talk about them slights, we talk about them like they're microaggressions, but they actually have a long-ranging impact. And then the response situation, right? It's a catch-22. You're a little bit damned if you do, a little bit damned if you don't, right? Because if you do, all of a sudden you're that person. You're the aggressive person. You're the person who can't take a joke. You're the person who's not a team player. You're the person who doesn't have a cultural fit, right? That's who you are. On the other hand, if you don't say anything, right, because you value your job, because you value your teammates liking you, whatever it is, like now you're suffering in silence and you're getting kind of like beat over this every day, and it really takes a toll on not just your work life, but your life as a whole. So it's kind of, it's not a win-win, unfortunately. It's a lose-lose. That would be the right. Okay, so what I want to do now is go over some of the, because I think the thing that's really interesting about this is thinking about, again, people are coming at it with the best of intentions, theoretically, right? We're going to give them the benefit of the doubt, right? They're not outright racist, sexist, misogynist, whatever. And the thing that I want to talk about a little bit is like looking at both sides of that equation, right? What did I mean when I said that thing? How did you receive it? What is the context that I didn't get that made you receive it that way? How can I learn about that? How can I put myself in those shoes? What else do I need to understand about the broader global context in order for me to not do that kind of thing again? So this is going to be teamwork. It's going to be a working session here. So starting with, what it doesn't have is my notes. So we're going to, again, I said I'm not an expert in this, so I wrote some stuff down, but I will pretend like I'm going to be able to remember them. So, so you're black, but you're so articulate. Who would like to talk about what you think? So I'm going, person A is the person who says the thing, person B is the person who receives the thing. So what do we think person A, what do we think they were trying to do? What was the intent? Good. You have to say it into the microphone because there's people who
They're
are
recording,
transcribing.
so I have a microphone runner. Compliment.
Okay. So compliment, who said compliment? It was you? Can you give him back the mic? Can you? Yeah. We're going to have a conversation now. It's a workshop. I'm taking this seriously. All right, so it's a compliment. What's the context of that compliment, right? Why wouldn't I be articulate?
I don't know the context. Maybe the context here, I guess, is what's relevant here, I guess, is the racial ethnicity of the speakers.
Yes, right. And I think that makes sense. So I think for me, there's a little bit of, okay, so now, since you have the microphone, if you're person B, you're a black person, how do you receive it? What does it mean to you? What are the right? You're not taking it necessarily as a compliment. What do you think it means?
Sure. I think the implication is that generally the speaker believes that black people are not articulate, and then you're an exception to that. I am an exception as person B to that.
Okay. I think that makes sense. And I guess thank you. Does anybody have anything else to add in terms of like the historical context? I mean, some of the things that I thought about around this was certainly around kind of Jim Crow stuff and separation of separate but equal, right? And so the idea of like, well, our education has not been as good, and perception in the media of stereotypes and ebonics, which like came up in the 90s and was like a legitimate thing and all that stuff. So does anybody else have any historical context that you want to add?
It's not necessarily historical, but my immediate reaction to that statement, because I do hear it a lot, is articulate compared to what?
Right.
Like, how am I articulate, quote unquote? Like, what are you comparing it to that has you even say that to me as a compliment?
Right. I think
right?
that makes sense.
Yeah.
And I will add a historical context. I'm from Georgia. Slavery usually prohibited, the slaves, they were denied access to education. They weren't taught to read. Like it was a separation of power. It was a power play that, continues.
Yeah. And again, so some of this is really about sharing, because again, I don't necessarily think about all the historical context, and so I think it's really important to have this, so that I want to have these conversations, so I'm going to let you.
I think it's also saying, it's comparing that, for example, if you're speaking specifically of Ebonics, it's saying what we see of value, what we see as articulate is specific to like white spaces and those specific standards of what articulate is, rather than other forms of American English.
I think that's a great point, yes. That's the whole idea of it's like soccer and women's soccer, right? Literature and African American literature. That's not, yeah, I think that's a really, really great point. I'm going to move on to the next one. You speak such good English, to somebody who is from this country. Anybody want to talk about what it means? What do we think person A was trying to say? And go to it. He raised his hand. He raised his hand a bunch.
He's wearing it, so I was like, is he stretching?
I think it's like maybe in a historical context, maybe English isn't something that is a native language to someone that might look like me or something like that. So that's the first thing that came to mind when you said that.
Now, no, you can't hang on. Now you volunteered. So if you're person B, right, if you're the Asian American who has been here, whose family has been here for generations, how do you think you respond to oh, gosh, you speak English so well?
I mean, I usually would just say, not as an Asian American, but as someone that has parents that aren't from here, that are immigrants, I would say, why would you expect that either me or maybe my family wouldn't speak good English?
Yeah. Yeah, and I think you made an interesting distinction there, which is your parents immigrated to this country.
Yes.
Right. This person in this scenario, is not, is kind of nowhere near an immigrant, right? There are Asian Americans who are, American, who speak the English, right? I mean, it's a little bit of an odd assumption that just because you don't look, I don't know, like a wasp or whatever it might be, that you must be from someplace else, that you must have an accent, that you must, and again, this clearly does not just apply to Asian Americans, but I think it's a common one. Yes. Yes, microphone, please.
Thank you. Well, and I think especially in America, when so many people claim that we're a melting pot and we celebrate anybody can be here, and it's especially wrong to try and gain the benefits of pretending like you accept everyone, while also perpetuating that there's just one group that is American.
Right.
You have to look a certain way to automatically be assumed that you're American.
Yeah, exactly. I will say Latinos get this a lot too. All right, anybody else want to comment on that one? Okay. Coworkers raising their voice when speaking to a man that is blind. Has anybody experienced that or been around it? Yes? I know you just spoke. Can anybody else volunteer to talk about why somebody who is blind might be offended by that or perceive it as a microaggression? Okay, I'll go. Oh, wait, you want to go? I mean, some of what we're doing is empathizing, so.
Yeah, it seems like it implies that the blind person who is sightless, that their other senses don't work either, they're also suddenly deaf or something else. As if for some reason, I see this also too, even when talking to people who are not at all visually impaired or hearing impaired, but they just happen to have an accent or something, and people will just speak louder as if that is clearer.
So the implication can be a little bit that you're lesser than, right? Mm-hmm. That you're not able to process, or you're right that you have disabilities that reach beyond not being able to see. And so, what were we talking about here? I frankly don't know historical context on this, but because but I think that experience, again, some of this is about like experiences. Most of the stuff that we work on are things that are stories that we've heard, and then we kind of fictionalize them and take them and extract from them.
I think some of the historical
Sorry, you need a microphone. We have a transcription.
Some of the historical context also goes around access to education. And I think in the early days, they didn't have access to education if you were blind or deaf or otherwise. And so I think there's the same kind of connotation around you're less educated, less intelligent around it.
That's a great point. By the way, for those of you who joined late, I started this saying like that I was not necessarily an expert, and we were going to be learning together. So feel free to jump in. I don't necessarily know all the things. Oh, we got another one.
I have more of a question. I don't know why I made it kind of relate to a colleague that has English as a second language. I had my previous job, I managed her, and I noticed people would speak more loudly to her, just because she would have trouble and she actually would call herself out. Is that kind of related, or
so
dealing with that?
Yeah, I mean, I suspect that from an intent perspective, and again, well, we didn't actually talk about what person A, the person who actually is saying it, what their intent is. And again, my guess is they're trying to be helpful, right? They think they're being helpful. What they don't realize is that how it's being taken and how it's being interpreted is in fact insulting. And so I suspect, again, I wouldn't relate necessarily somebody who's blind with somebody who has an accent or it's their second language. I think those are different things. Because I also think that you can speak English fluently with an accent, right? So so there's all this stuff that's in there. But I think it's the same type of thing where people think they're being helpful, and they don't necessarily recognize that actually they're being insulting or offending people. Oh. You're too pretty, socially adept, tall, whatever it is, to be an engineer. Anybody experience that in the room? No crying.
Oh God. No, it's just laughable how many times I've heard it.
Right.
And I'm not sure what question I'm answering right now, but when it comes to
what do you think person A was intending when they say stuff like that?
What I've perceived is just like I'm in the wrong field. Like I could be doing something different than being behind a desk where no one would really see me.
Right. So that's what you as person B receive it as. What do you think they mean it as?
No, I don't necessarily perceive it as that.
Okay.
That's what I really think they're trying to say. Like
I could you should be in a different field?
Yeah, completely different, something where like I can use that part. How I perceive it is that my looks are more important than what my brain can actually like offer. Like that's more important, and why don't I utilize that versus utilizing like this computer of a brain that I have?
Right.
Yeah.
Okay. Karen, did you want to add to that? Hold on.
I think that this happens because people are they're uncomfortable and they're trying to make a connection and pay a compliment, and so it comes out just in this form of "you look too pretty," whatever. For me, I don't know if I've ever heard "you're too pretty," but I've heard, so you work in tech, do you work in HR or in marketing? And that's how this shows up for me. And again, it's like they're trying to make a connection, they're trying to further the conversation, but it's a microaggression.
Yeah. A couple of things that I want to add just to that point, actually, the kind of marketing HR thing. That is true for a lot of female software engineers, especially so Black and Latinx folks in STEM. 42% of us have been mistaken for the administrative assistants.
And can I just add, there's nothing wrong with HR or marketing.
Exactly.
I should have added that.
Or administrative assistants.
Or anything, but it's just like when you're a
being
woman with
defined.
a tech degree, and it's just one more subtle reminder you really don't look the part.
I'm also going to flip it around, which is like, wow, is that an insult to all the other engineers? Like, I don't understand. They're not social and good looking and nice, and what? Why is that okay?
I guess to jump onto that, a lot of these things feel like the tokenizing, like, oh, you're one of the good ones, which reinforces structural racism and other stereotypes.
Right. Person in the back had a, got away from the microphone.
Just in the interest of keeping this as a live, interactive workshop, the thing that these quotes bring to mind for me as they all make me cringe. I'm wondering, I'd like to practice as someone who's an aspiring ally, what I can do as person C who overhears a comment like this and what we can do better. Maybe we're getting to that.
We are getting to that. In fact, there's a whole slide just for that. Yeah, and we're going to wrap up on this section anyway. But it really is like there is a lot of like, you know, there's so many that I could have said, right? Oh, you look really good for your age, right? I can't believe you're almost 50. No, that's what 50 looks like. This is what an engineer looks like. Oh, you're really athletic or move really well for a big girl, right? Or you're pretty for a dark girl. Like there's all of the stuff. All of the stuff. What I was gonna do was get some from the audience. But we have 20 minutes. Unless somebody's dying to talk about, share one that nobody has heard before, bring it.
I was out with a couple of friends who were visiting from Seattle, and they happened to be a male-male couple, and somebody actually blurted out, like, oh my gosh, you have a kid? And then when I actually, as person C, jumped in and I said, what did you mean by that? And they actually said, like, they're so gay.
Yeah, I actually had a bunch of examples around, yeah. Sorry. It's a thing. Anybody else have other ones they want to share? Because again, back there, because part of it is about if you're not part of that community, you're not necessarily hearing these things.
It's odd that you're good at soccer.
Say it again?
It's odd that you're good at soccer. I was raised in a Mexican-American household. My stepdad was from Mexico, and he raised me. And so I played soccer since I was 6.
And it says...
And in high school, I heard that it was weird that I was good at it.
It's weird. Wow. Okay.
Sometimes it's not necessarily what they say, it's where they put those little question marks. Oh, you went to Stanford, or you went to Stanford?
Oh yeah, I just as a little side anecdote, I was with the chief technology. I used to work at the White House for those who came late. I was with the chief technology officer of the United States of America. Me and him, we were partners, equal partners, doing recruiting, and a man who I would have thought of as a friend came up to me afterward and was like, "Why did they pick you?" Thank you for playing. They actually rescinded his job offer. What the hell's the matter with you? All righty. All right, so one of the things that I want to cover, because again, workshop, is what can you do? And so I tried to think about it from a couple of different angles. So one is if you're the one who's actually been offended. 2 is if you have unintentionally offended somebody. 3 is if you are a bystander, and 4 is if you are in HR or D&I or belonging, equity, inclusion, culture. Okay. So these are slides that I updated, so I'm not 100% sure whether they're the most recent ones or not. All right, we're going to go with this one. So if you have been offended, and again, working session, so I'm going to say some things. Feel free to jump in with other ideas, suggestions, opinions, please. Back here. It doesn't work as well with progressives, FYI. All right, so the first thing is if you have been offended. If somebody said something to you like, it's weird that you play soccer so well. The first thing is you should check for your safety first, right? Assess the situation. What does a win look like? Do you think the person, if you were to say something, would receive it? There's actually a bunch of research and studies around microaggressions, and one of the suggestions that one of the researchers has put out there is, hey, you know, like if you're a black man and you walk into an elevator and there's a white woman standing there and she clutches her purse, you should say something. If you're a black man, if you are in an enclosed space with a white woman who's already feeling insecure about your being in the elevator, maybe that's actually not the best move. And so really thinking about what the environment looks like, what your safety looks like, what do you think will be accomplished? Do you think you can actually change, their minds, their hearts, inform them? So that's the first thing that you should always think about. The second thing is, again, we're talking about microaggressions, and the assumption here is that people actually aren't trying to be offensive. They actually are trying to give you a compliment. They mean, in their heads, something positive. And so there is something about trying to make sure that you are assuming the best of intentions. And you want to check your body language. You want to check like the tone, how you're talking to them about it. Again, if you're ready to take this step. Sometimes it's important to take a deep breath before you go in, right? Use I statements. So actually talk to them about how it makes you feel, right? It's not the like, you did this thing intentionally, but when you did this, it made me feel this way because, and right, so that they won't feel as attacked. You can also share information. Now, I'm a big fan of not having the burden be on the folks who are underrepresented. But again, if you're feeling comfortable, if you're feeling like you're in that space and feeling generous of spirit, tell them what they can Google, right? Just to be clear, you don't got to do all the work for them, right? You don't have to like go into the historical context. But on the other hand, feel free to be like, if you Google these terms, some stuff will come out that might actually help you understand my perspective or other people's perspective, or how you could say that differently. So in the product, we actually have a bunch, so because this is one of our specific topics, we actually have a bunch of other suggestions if you are the person who has been offended. But I want to get to the others as well. The thing that is important to understand is the research has actually shown that even if you do take subtle corrections, people will hear it and actually change their behavior. So that's something to weigh as you think about what approach you want to take on it. Anybody have anything else that they want to jump in on terms of if you have been offended, what you can do? All right, I'll keep it on.
Here's a hand.
Oh, microphone.
Well, I hear these things all the time, right? You are from Russia, you must be drinking a lot of vodka and stuff like that.
You must be what?
Drinking a lot of vodka. Or you're from Siberia, you're from Gulag. All the time, really. I stopped getting offended because I'm full of stupid stereotypes myself, and that's where this is coming from. And person apparently just it's usually a friend who trusts you enough to come out with a stupid joke like that. So that's in itself is kind of a compliment, the way I take it. And then, they didn't mean anything, they didn't mean any offense by that, usually. Or it is just like they are trying to come up with a conversation starter, and that's the best they could come up with. So I usually let it slide or give a joke in response, and like I kindly mention that it may have been true 20 years ago, but not anymore.
Right. Yeah,
Things like that.
I think that's interesting. Right. I think that the other thing that I didn't say, and there's somebody in the back too. The other thing that I didn't say is, for the record, like one person's microaggressions is not necessarily somebody else's microaggression. Right. My interpretation of a thing, right, based on my experience and my history and where I grew up and how I grew up and what, right, how many damn people have touched my hair in the last week, right? My experience might be very different from somebody else's of my same race, gender, whatever it is. And so I think that that's right. But I think you talked about kind of other information, providing them some additional context. And I think that, to your point, like assessing the situation, like how much is it affecting you? How much do you want to put yourself out there, and how you feel about it?
Quick question. Some of these microaggressions, though, you may have covered this already. Sometimes they feel like they are sort of rooted in systemic racism or systemic sexism.
Yeah.
So, like, for some, like, I would think it's completely racist to go up to someone who's from Russia and say, you must drink X, Y, and Z. Like, to me, those kind of microaggressions, or as an African-American man walking across the street, on a good day, I'm 5'6", and someone locks their doors, right? Like, a lot of that stuff is, like, rooted in systemic racism. Yeah. So at what point do you go to HR if someone's behavior is just clearly unacceptable?
That is a good question. And by the way, there was somebody else who had their hand up.
I saw you.
which is, so we did, when we started out with the, like, we went through a couple of microaggressions and talked about the historical context of some of them, for sure. I think that I'm not a lawyer and I'm not in HR. Microaggressions are, I don't want to say statements. I was going to say microaggressions are not typically fireable offenses, right? And so one of the things that I think is important is for HR to be attuned to the culture of the work environment. And that's one of the things that I actually talk about from an HR perspective. From somebody who has actually been offended perspective, I think it is your call in terms of what will make you feel safe and protected. So going to HR, what will that accomplish? What will be the win out of there? And how will it reflect on you, right? From my perspective, it's safety first. And so you would be the best judge of what your HR department will do with that information and whether that will be a ding against you in the long run, whether that means you are not a team player, whether it means, you know, those kinds of things, or whether they will actually take that in and try to make change from it. And so I think, so yes, yes and. So it depends on kind of your current situation.
Just wanted to add one more thing that I try to do if I've been on the side of being offended, is I like to ask questions. So, you know, there's a statement being made, you're too pretty to be an engineer. Oh, what are engineers supposed to look like?
Yeah.
And that way you're not seen as being defensive or angry, and you're like putting it on them to actually analyze, like, oh, what did I actually say? And usually people figure it out without you having to say anything.
Yeah.
I think as the person who's from an underrepresented or marginalized community, like you have that burden of, if I speak up, if I make myself look angry, then I further alienate myself as one of the only on this team. And I don't want to do that, you know? And so that's just a way for you to make it seem like an easy way to have that conversation without being mad.
I think that's right. And actually, because I was trying to transcribe some stuff from our product, that's actually the next one. Another one is using humor. I'm actually going to move on because we have 8 minutes left. Is that okay? Okay. Because a part of it, I want to get to some of the other questions. And so we're going to try to power through this. And sorry. Okay. If you have unintentionally offended, this is the slide that is updated. So I'm just going to read off of mine. Sorry, you don't get to see it. So first and foremost, listen. So secondly is try to recognize the impact of the statement. So again, if you have said something that somebody said, I am offended by this, it's really about trying to hear them. Don't go dark. You want to try to identify why the comment was offensive. Educate yourself, right? Don't necessarily depend on the person who's telling you. Like, take the onus on yourself to actually figure out, like, oh, wait, what is the context? What am I missing? What did I not think about when I said that? You want to try to minimize defensiveness. It is super natural for us to be like, but that's not what I meant, right? That is, like, it's normal. And so then the question is, how do you kind of back away from that and kind of like, and let it steep and take it in? And reflect on the role that you actually played in the situation, right? Because it is about you. It's about both parties, but one of the parties is you. You want to allow yourself to be uncomfortable and vulnerable, right? And that's super hard. But those of us who are underrepresented live that all day, every day. So it's okay to feel it for somebody else and to try to empathize. You want to apologize authentically, right? I'm sorry you took it that way, right? It's right? You want to actually, and the apology is really the hardest part of the process, but it's also the most transformative. So figuring out how to say it in a way that is authentic. You want to demonstrate curiosity and humility. So you want to seek more understanding, right? You want to be open to this. You want people to be able to come and talk to you about these things. And then lastly, thank you for the feedback, right? I've learned something from this. This is a gift that you gave me that you didn't have to give me. You could have gone off mad thinking I was a creep. I am actually going to keep going. No audience takers right now. Oh, next slide. Maybe at the end, if we have time, we can get some more suggestions, so store them up. All right, so if you're a bystander, so you're not party A, you're not party B, you're walking down the street with your two friends. So the first does speak up. Right? There could be a role for an ally where the people involved are not in as safe a place, and so you're being able to do that is really important. You want to, again, different slide, sorry. You want to encourage the offender to apologize, right? You want to help them deconstruct the comments' implications, help them reflect, and help them learn, right? So you're not just an ally to the person who's been offended, but you're an ally to the person who has unintentionally done the offending, right? It really is about generosity of spirit, understanding that people are not intentionally trying to do this stuff, and so how can you help them grow, learn, understand more? Be an ally, accomplice, co-conspirator. Different people like different terms. I'm okay with all of them. You want to be careful that you are not trying to be a hero or a savior. I won't get into it too much, but Google. You want to acknowledge that you recognize the situation, right? And offer your support to the person who maybe felt aggressed or offended. You kind of other things around allyship, right, is consciously exposing yourself to others who don't look like you or come from your same background, whether that's in-person networking, whether that's following people on Twitter, whether that is reading authors of different genders, sexual orientation, across the spectrum. And you want to learn from constant vigilance, right? So being mindful about what's going on in the world and in the workplace. Right? And so if an unarmed black man has gotten shot by a cop, understand that some people might be real sensitive, right? That's my cousin, that's my brother. And for the record, you don't gotta be black to be real sensitive about that, but just be aware of kind of the larger context of what's happening. I like how I'm moving these slides forward, like y'all can see what I'm reading. All right, so if you are in HR and D&I, anybody in the room in HR or D&I? All right, cool. First, acknowledge its existence, right? Just because you might not be hearing about it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. In fact, it likely does. You want to proactively tackle toxic work environments, but that requires a commitment to action. This is not something that just, you have to be intentional about it. It's not something that's just gonna happen. You have to be really thoughtful about it. You can set up systems like TEQuitable, where employees from any perspective have a safe place to discuss and reflect on situations, right? And so that's, you can be party A, you can be party B, you can be a bystander, right? This is not just about supporting the underrepresented folks, but it's across the board, across the spectrum. I talked about this a little bit, which is make sure the burden is not on the people who have been marginalized to fix it, right? That's not, I often use the example of like, you don't ask the homeless to solve world hunger, right? Like that's not where they're at. And so how do you actually, and the same thing that the other thing is, how do we prevent men from raping women? We don't tell women to not dress a certain way or go a certain place. We teach men to not rape, right? Like you really gotta think about kind of where the onus needs to be and focus on that. Exposure and education. So you can hold events, celebrations, book clubs, discussion groups. Make sure there's continuous learning, not just in your subject matter expertise, not just in employee subject matter expertise, but across the board, right? We've kind of learned that things that make for good employees in tech are not just, oh, look, I'm a rock star coder, but it really is about collaboration, interactions, understanding your customer, understanding your audience, communication, all of those things, and this is just part of that. Make it not a bad thing to talk about, right? Inclusion and belonging should be part of the everyday course of business. It's not one-offs. It's not just like, oh, a thing. Again, most of us live it every day, and it really should be a shared burden. And combat microaggressions at the individual, institutional, and societal levels. So really quickly, research has shown that psychological safety is the most critical factor in making teams successful, and that's exactly what TEQuitable is working on. That's part of why I wanted to talk to you all. In particular, I'm going to skip this. We do two things. One is we provide a sounding board for employees where they can come and get advice, explore their options, and figure out what their next steps should be. And that's part of so again, we have a whole bunch of different modules around microaggressions. How do you respond to them? How can you be an ally? How do you be an active bystander? All those types of things. We think about it almost as just-in-time learning, just-in-time training. Like, if something happens, I can talk to somebody, I can learn how I should respond to it, I can kind of ease my way into it. We have a bunch of different options, but it really is about supporting and empowering employees. And then on the flip side of that, what we do is, while that's happening, we collect data that we anonymize and aggregate, and we use that to identify systemic issues within a company's culture, so we can create recommendations to actually address these issues, and we can actually create a report for the management team so it can be fixed. So for us, it's really important that we work on both sides of the equation, where we empower and support employees, but we're also empowering and support companies and creating this virtuous cycle so we can affect real change. Thank you. That's what we're trying to do. We're trying to fix this. This goes back to the how do we use technology to solve problems that have been previously thought of as intractable? How do we make societal change? And that's what we're trying to do here. And I think I might just be on time. It's 11:50. Should we wrap? Do I want to take questions? Tell me what I have to do.
Technically, you have till 12, right? So if there are questions, comments.
Questions, comments.
Yeah, I just wanted to revisit a point earlier where somebody in the back had mentioned that these microaggressions, that maybe some people are gonna just, just treat it as like it's a joke, it's no big deal. But as the person mentioned, I do think these are connected to systemic racism that we see on various levels. And the way that I view it is sort of like a hierarchy, and I think microaggressions are kind of at the bottom of that pyramid, and it's all connected and builds up to ultimately, violence and destruction of marginalized groups in this country. And I feel like in order to start dismantling the whole system, you have to call out when you can. When you see this in the office, when you see this amongst your friends, when you see this anywhere else, even if it makes people uncomfortable, I think it's really important. I think the hardest work is always going to be uncomfortable, but it's going to have ultimately the best results. And in order to start dismantling the entire pyramid, you have to start at the bottom. So I'm always a big advocate of just calling people out on this stuff. I mean, not aggressively, of course, in a way that's sustainable and allows for a healthy conversation, and but I think it's important that we address it when we see it.
Yeah, and again, as long as you feel safe, I think that would be great. The one thing that I do actually want to address about what you said about going to HR, that this triggered for me, which is, and again, not a lawyer, the EEOC kind of definition of what makes for, the term is not toxic work environment, but basically when you want to file a complaint around harassment or discrimination or bias, it can be one severe incident, or it can be a series of smaller incidents that happen regularly over time. And so again, from how you want to think about it, to your point, right? There's a whole scale and severity of different issues, but it doesn't have to be the extreme to go to HR. If you actually have a series of these things, you can also kind of move forward with that.
Documentation.
I'm not a lawyer, so I wouldn't say documentation, but what she said.
Well, thank you for your talk. And as I was thinking, I recalled maybe it's a microaggression. I'm an engineer, but I'm passionate about diversity and inclusion in the workspace and in companies wherever I am. And I've been told, you're an engineer, you shouldn't focus about D&I or DEI. Just focus on the engineering. How do we respond to that?
Okay, that's a hard one for me. Here is the thing. So I talk a lot in front of audiences. Specifically, I talk a lot to Black audiences and underrepresented folks, specifically in tech, specifically as engineers. And I get asked that question a lot. How do I convince my company, my boss, whatever, that this is a really important issue? My answer is, your job is to do the job that they are paying you for really, really, really well, so that you can get promoted and bring on more people who look like you and who are like you. And I know people feel some kind of way about that, but at the end of the day, if you are not getting promoted and recognized and rewarded for the work that they want you to do, it can have repercussions on the back end. So if somebody else wants to give them a different answer, I'm okay with that, but that's what I would say. Sorry.
I actually had one question, but since you mentioned you weren't a lawyer, I'm in HR, and I'll say what she said, which is documentation, documentation, documentation. But I'm curious, I'm actually putting together workshops around uncovering unconscious bias, trying to be more of an ally, I guess. How do you describe the relationship between microaggressions and unconscious bias? Because it almost seems to me that microaggressions are almost like a verbalized unconscious bias. But I'm curious to get your perspective as how you see the relationship between those two.
It's a great question, and I feel like somebody in the back stood up because they wanted to give a different answer.
I was just going to echo. I am in HR also. I think people teams need to do more to reduce the barriers of reporting so that we can make companies better companies. And so if you are in a company that has a people team that has that charter, go to them. If you're not, also look at things like anonymous reporting. So a lot of times companies, because boards care about this kind of issue. Yes. And so
everybody in the room who's in HR or D&I, you should get TEQuitable. Just to be clear, if I wasn't clear, if that wasn't salesy enough, I can help. Going back to, and I'll talk to you afterwards also. But to answer your question, I was thinking about that. I was putting this together. I very specifically chose not to use the words unconscious bias in the deck at all. Again, because at this point, some people are like triggered by that, like, oh, I have to go to this unconscious bias training, right? And so for me, I tried to tease it apart a little bit. I think they certainly go hand in hand. In my head, unconscious bias is a more deeply held belief, right? Like that, whatever power dynamic I have, right, can play into that. Whereas for me, the difference between the microaggression is like typically, and the way that I'm using it to describe it here, is like I actually meant it as a compliment, right? And so yes, they're kind of they're real close to each other in my head. Again, this is just my personal definition of it. I see this kind of as much more systemic. It feeds into this, but this is really like I'm trying to do a good thing. Right, as opposed, that's how I see it. But they're real close.
Time check, 5 minutes. Just taking a couple of last questions.
4 minutes. And after you, it's going to be you because you haven't spoken yet. Sorry.
On a maybe slightly lighter note, I guess, and I am by no means an HR or lawyer, so do not take this as advice or anything. But I have a friend who is he is mixed race, black and white, I believe. He's sort of a light skin, so he very easily sort of passes as being something else or some other, I guess, blend of ethnicities. So he's often asked kind of the question, like, if he tells people that he's black, they're like, no, you're not really, like, you must be something else, that kind of thing. And
I don't know what you're talking about.
Mm-hmm, right. Very unfamiliar. Uh-huh. Like, really? No. They lied to you type of stuff. So he says that, and I've low-key been dying to do this, but he says that his favorite response to when they sort of keep digging into that question is just sort of going, do you think this conversation is going well? And I don't want that conversation to happen to me, but I'm really dying to say that, so... Just wanted to share that.
I love it. All right, last comment.
Who is it?
Standing.
I just wanted to add to the unconscious bias versus microaggressions. My company is actually developing like a training around this, and unconscious bias refers to the cognitive biases that we all have. So like affirmation bias, like if someone's agreeing with you, they must be the most correct person in the room, stuff like that. So that does interact with things like racism, homophobia, whatever, but they are distinct from each other, if that helps.
What she said.
Let's give Lisa a huge round of applause.
Thank you all for participating. That was awesome.
Amazing.